Kristen Chavez was the devoted nurse, the suburban mother, the woman everyone thought they knew, while Daniel Chavez was the charming real estate agent, the husband whose sudden distance pushed their marriage to the edge. But when love turned to suspicion and suspicion turned to rage, their picture-perfect life ended in one of the most chilling crimes their quiet neighborhood had ever seen. Kristen Chavez appeared to have everything a person could want. She lived in a peaceful neighborhood on the outskirts of Phoenix, surrounded by neat lawns, trimmed hedges, and friendly neighbors who waved as they passed by. To those who saw her, she was the picture of stability, a caring mother, a dedicated nurse, and a woman who seemed to balance the weight of her responsibilities with quiet grace. Her husband, Daniel, worked in real estate and was known for his charm and success. Together, they had 2 children who were often seen riding bikes on the cul-de-sac or playing in the yard. From the outside, the Chavez family looked like the perfect example of the American dream. Yet perfection is often an illusion. Inside their home, Kristen and Daniel's marriage had begun to fracture. The once affectionate couple rarely shared more than a few words at the dinner table. Their conversations were practical, distant, and heavy with unspoken resentment. Arguments broke out behind closed doors, sometimes loud enough for the children to overhear. Kristen tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, smiling at neighbors and attending community events, but the cracks in her marriage grew deeper with each passing week. The foundation of their troubles was complicated. Long hours at work left Daniel exhausted and unavailable, while Kristen felt abandoned, carrying the emotional weight of both her job and her family. Financial pressures mounted as real estate sales slowed, and whispers of Daniel's possible infidelity only fueled Kristen's insecurities. The once warm bond between them turned cold, a silence that seemed to stretch endlessly through the walls of their home. To the outside world, Kristen's life looked picture-perfect, but beneath the surface, the story was already unraveling, setting the stage for a tragedy no one could have predicted. The growing distance between Kristen and Daniel didn't go unnoticed. Kristen often confided in her co-workers at the hospital, unable to carry the weight of her suspicions and frustrations alone. She spoke about how Daniel no longer looked at her the way he once did, how he returned home late without explanation, and how he seemed to find excuses to avoid spending time with her and the children. What started as quiet complaints eventually turned into worried confessions, whispered during lunch breaks or late-night shifts. Her colleagues, though sympathetic, could see that Kristen was unraveling under the pressure of a crumbling marriage. At home, the atmosphere had changed entirely. Meals were eaten in silence, broken only by the clinking of forks on plates. Daniel seemed distracted, his phone constantly in hand, responding to messages he wouldn't explain. When Kristen asked him where he had been or who he was speaking to, his replies were short, defensive, and dismissive. Rumors of an affair began to swirl in Kristen's mind. She never caught him outright, but the evidence seemed to be everywhere. Lipstick stains on a shirt, a receipt from a dinner she hadn't attended, and a faint trace of perfume that wasn't hers. The tension spread like poison through the household. Kristen grew restless, her sleep disturbed by racing thoughts and an uneasy heart. She started watching Daniel more closely, memorizing his routines, and obsessing over his behavior. The children noticed the change as well, sensing the shift even if they didn't understand it. Kristen's once calm demeanor gave way to bursts of irritation and long spells of silence. The woman who had always appeared so composed was now consumed by doubt, frustration, and fear. What had once been small cracks in her marriage had become deep fractures, impossible to ignore. The news of Daniel wanting a divorce struck Kristen like a thunderbolt. It wasn't just the end of a marriage for her. It felt like the end of her identity, the collapse of everything she had built her life around. Daniel told her bluntly that he was unhappy, that their relationship was beyond repair, and that it was better for both of them to move on. For Kristen, those words cut deeper than any physical wound. She had invested her youth, her love, and her energy into holding their family together. Now, in a single moment, it seemed to vanish. She couldn't stop thinking about the future and how quickly it was slipping out of her control. The fear of losing her children haunted her most. She imagined custody battles, courtrooms, and the possibility that Daniel might take them away if he proved her unstable. Each night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind running in endless circles. The thought of Daniel leaving her for another woman only added to her torment. In her imagination, she saw him smiling at someone else, giving away the love that was once hers. Friends and co-workers noticed the transformation. Kristen grew thin, her face pale and tired, with dark shadows under her eyes. She spoke less, and when she did, her words carried a sharp edge of bitterness. Her once gentle voice now trembled with anger and despair. She stopped enjoying the small things that once gave her comfort, reading before bed, tending to her garden, or baking with her children. Instead, her life became consumed with a single obsession: stopping Daniel from leaving. The fear of abandonment turned into rage, and the rage simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt. Kristen was reaching a dangerous breaking point. The night of May 12, 2021, began like so many others in the Chavez home: quiet, heavy with tension, and filled with unspoken hostility. Kristen had prepared a simple dinner, setting the table with the same practiced routine she always followed, though her mind was far from calm. Hours passed, and Daniel still hadn't returned home. Each tick of the clock seemed to dig deeper into her already frayed nerves. When the front door finally opened close to midnight, the smell of alcohol filled the air. Daniel walked in without explanation, his tie loosened and his shirt wrinkled, his eyes avoiding hers. The silence didn't last. Accusations quickly flew, one after another. Kristen's voice rose, sharp with anger, while Daniel countered with dismissive remarks, brushing off her questions. The argument grew louder, echoing off the walls, words cutting through the fragile quiet of the house. In the kitchen, the fight reached its peak. Years of resentment, betrayal, and frustration boiled over in a single moment. Kristen's rage, fueled by fear and desperation, overcame any sense of reason. In the heat of that storm, she reached for the knife lying on the counter, its blade catching the dim light. Her hand shook as fury took over, and in an instant that would change everything, she struck. Daniel collapsed, his body hitting the cold tile floor, the life draining from him far too quickly. The kitchen, once a place of family meals and laughter, became a scene of horror. The reality of what she had done hit her with crushing weight. Kristen dropped the knife, her breath shallow, her hands trembling and smeared with blood. The house fell into silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of her panicked heartbeat. In that moment, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. Kristen's panic surged the moment Daniel's body lay still on the kitchen floor. The weight of her actions pressed down on her chest, and for a few minutes she stood frozen, staring at the blood that spread across the tiles. Every thought collided at once: fear of prison, fear of losing her children, fear of being branded a murderer. Then, in a frantic burst of desperation, her mind shifted toward survival. If she could make it look like someone else had done this, maybe she still had a chance to protect herself and her family's image. She dragged Daniel's body across the floor, leaving faint smears despite her attempts to wipe them clean. The garage seemed like the safest place to hide him temporarily. She laid him there clumsily, his shirt torn and stained, before rushing back into the house to erase the chaos she had created. She scrubbed the counters and the floor, but every time she thought she had removed the traces, new spots appeared in the dim light. Her hands burned from cleaning, yet nothing seemed enough. To make the scene believable, she turned her attention to staging a break-in. She smashed a small kitchen window from the inside, scattering shards of glass across the floor. The sound echoed loudly in the night, sending a shiver through her body. She tipped over chairs, pulled drawers halfway open, and left the living room in disarray. Jewelry boxes were moved, but nothing was taken, a mistake she didn't recognize in her frantic state. As she looked around at the chaos, Kristen convinced herself the plan could work. Exhaustion and shock blurred her judgment, but she clung to the hope that detectives would see what she wanted them to see: a burglary gone wrong. Beneath that fragile hope, dread was already beginning to creep in. At sunrise, Kristen sat trembling on the edge of her bed, rehearsing the words she would use when she called for help. Her mind replayed the night in frantic loops, but she forced herself to steady her breathing and pick up the phone. When the operator answered, her voice cracked as she claimed she had woken to find the house in shambles and her husband dead. The call was laced with feigned panic, though beneath it, Her exhaustion and strain were hard to conceal. Within minutes, patrol cars pulled up to the Chavez home, their flashing lights casting eerie patterns across the quiet suburban street. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, stunned to see the once idyllic house become the center of sudden tragedy. Officers entered cautiously, surveying the supposed crime scene. From the start, small details raised suspicions. The broken window looked unusual. The shards of glass were scattered mostly inside rather than outside, suggesting it had been smashed from within. Detectives noted that while drawers were pulled open and furniture was overturned, nothing of value seemed to be missing. Electronics, jewelry, and cash were all untouched. The scene felt staged, too deliberate, too clean in certain places, yet strangely careless in others. Their attention soon turned to Kristen herself. She appeared distraught, clutching her arms tightly, her eyes swollen and red. But her behavior wavered between moments of dramatic sobbing and oddly detached silence. When investigators moved into the garage, they found Daniel's body. The blood pattern told a different story than Kristen's. The position of the wounds and the lack of signs of forced entry contradicted her version of events. What was supposed to look like a burglary gone wrong already carried the unmistakable signs of something far more personal, and Kristen was at the center of it. Detectives began dissecting every detail of the Chavez home, determined to separate fact from fabrication. The knife recovered from the kitchen was the most glaring clue. It bore only Kristen's fingerprints, no trace of a stranger's touch. Blood spatter analysis suggested the attack happened in the kitchen, not during a chaotic struggle in the living room, as Kristen had insisted. The more investigators examined, the more her story unraveled. Security footage from homes nearby delivered another blow to her account. Cameras facing the street showed no signs of suspicious vehicles or unknown visitors entering the neighborhood during the night of May 12th. Instead, they revealed Daniel arriving home late, alone and unaccompanied. No shadowy figure slipped in or out. The absence of any outsider only tightened the circle around Kristen. Detectives studied her timeline carefully. She claimed to have discovered the scene in the early morning, but her cell phone records told a different story. Calls and text activity suggested she had been awake and active long before she dialed 911. Data from her phone's location services showed movement around the house late into the night, consistent with someone staging a scene rather than sleeping. During questioning, Kristen struggled to maintain her composure. Her answers grew inconsistent, small contradictions surfacing each time she repeated her version of events. She said she had been too frightened to check the garage, yet her fingerprints were found on the garage door and on objects nearby. Detectives noticed her nervous gestures, clenched fists, darting eyes, and long pauses before answering. The once believable mask of a grieving wife was beginning to slip. Evidence was mounting against her, piece by piece, and what initially appeared to be a tragic burglary now looked increasingly like a calculated cover-up to hide a deadly act of rage. As the investigation deepened, detectives turned their focus to Kristen's personal life, seeking to understand her state of mind in the months leading up to Daniel's death. They spoke with friends, family, and co-workers, piecing together fragments of her behavior and conversations. What emerged was a picture of a woman spiraling into despair. Kristen had confided in her closest colleagues that she feared Daniel was being unfaithful. She often described feeling invisible in her own home, as though her presence no longer mattered. Her words carried a mixture of anger and desperation, the kind that made those who listened uneasy. Several friends recalled moments when Kristen's emotions seemed uncontrollable. She had been overheard saying she couldn't bear the thought of Daniel leaving her. In one chilling recollection, a coworker remembered her remarking that if Daniel ever tried to walk away, she would make sure he never did. At the time, it was dismissed as an expression of frustration, but in hindsight, it sounded like a haunting glimpse of intent. Neighbors added their observations, too. They had noticed heated arguments spilling out into the yard, Kristen's voice sharp with fury while Daniel remained calm or walked away. On more than one occasion, Kristen had been seen sitting alone in her car late at night, staring blankly into the distance as though consumed by thoughts she couldn't escape. All these accounts painted a damning portrait for investigators. Kristen wasn't just a grieving widow caught in the chaos of tragedy. She was a woman unraveling, someone whose fear of abandonment had crossed into obsession. The testimonies built a clear motive. She was unwilling to let go of her marriage, and when Daniel pushed for divorce, her desperation had escalated into violence. What others once ignored now stood as powerful evidence. The trial of Kristen Chavez drew intense attention, both locally and beyond. Courtrooms are often places of raw emotion, but this case carried a particular weight. A woman once regarded as a loving mother and respected nurse now sat in the defendant's chair, accused of murdering her husband in cold blood. The prosecution wasted no time building their case, presenting the crime scene evidence piece by piece. The knife with Kristen's fingerprints, the staged break-in, and the inconsistencies in her story were all laid out in meticulous detail. Jurors were shown security footage proving no intruder had entered the neighborhood that night, dismantling Kristen's narrative of a burglary gone wrong. Witnesses further weakened her defense. Co-workers testified about her obsessive fears of abandonment and the disturbing comments she had made in the weeks before Daniel's death. Neighbors recalled heated arguments and late-night tensions spilling into public view. Even her closest friends admitted they had grown worried about her unstable behavior. The testimony made it difficult to believe the killing was anything other than deliberate. The defense attempted to counter, arguing that Kristen had acted in a moment of uncontrollable passion rather than premeditated intent. They painted her as a woman pushed beyond her limits, emotionally battered by years of marital strain and betrayal. They asked the jury to see her as a human being overwhelmed by despair rather than a calculated murderer. But the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic reports showed no signs of a struggle consistent with her claims, and the staged burglary was too obvious to ignore. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of the decision heavy in the room. When they returned, the verdict was clear: guilty of second-degree murder. Kristen's carefully constructed facade crumbled as the reality of her fate finally set in. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was filled with a tense, heavy silence. Relatives of both Kristen and Daniel sat on opposite sides, their faces etched with grief. The judge's words were steady and firm as the punishment was announced: 25 years in prison for the murder of her husband. Kristen stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the floor, as though refusing to accept the finality of what she had heard. The sound of muffled sobs from family members echoed through the room, each one a reminder of the lives shattered by her actions. The children were perhaps the greatest victims of all. Too young to fully understand the complexities of what had happened, they were suddenly left without both parents, their father gone forever and their mother locked away. They were placed in the care of relatives, their once stable lives upended in a single, violent night. For them, the family home that had once been a place of warmth and safety now carried the haunting memory of tragedy. The community also struggled to process the crime. Neighbors who once waved to Kristen as she tended her garden or watched her children play were stunned to learn the truth. They had believed her life was enviable, almost perfect, only to discover the devastating turmoil that had been hidden behind closed doors. Over time, the story of Kristen Chavez became more than just a local case. It served as a sobering reminder of how quickly an ordinary life can unravel. A troubled marriage, unresolved anger, and unchecked desperation had turned a suburban dream into a nightmare. The perfect family portrait had been torn apart, leaving behind only questions, regret, and a warning. Beneath the surface of normalcy, darkness can grow, and when left unchecked, it can end in blood.